Thank you so much, Dion, and good afternoon and good morning, colleagues, those who are far, and good afternoon and good evening to others. We are sitting in different areas of this world. My name is Sipho Mahokoto. I'm here at Stellenbosch University in Cape Town at the Faculty of Theology. I'm teaching systematic theology and ethics. I want to welcome everybody at this first meeting of the 70th birthday of Professor Dirkie Smit, who's our colleague here at Stellenbosch and also is a colleague with us everywhere in this world, a well-known scholar and a theologian, a father of us here at Stellenbosch. And Prof. Dirkie Smit, I really wish to welcome you first, as we are here because of you celebrating your 70th birthday. We want to welcome you on behalf of everyone who's here, but also a warm welcome in South Africa. I spoke to Nadia, Dr. Myer. She told me how on your birthday specifically, you come to the tea room and have your strawberries. Unfortunately, we are not wearing red ties now to celebrate your birthday in style with those red strawberries that you used to have in the tea room, especially when you are having your birthday. I also want to really welcome your family if they are joining. Also your colleagues, also here at the faculty and also in Princeton. We wish you a very, very welcome at this moment as we celebrate your birthday in style. But I also want to welcome on behalf of the organizers, all the speakers for this day, starting from today and tomorrow. We know we will really get everything from you and the work of Professor Dirkie Smit that really we want to harvest at this time and this moment from your wells and from your garden, Prof. Smit, as we welcome all the members who will be chairing these sessions, starting from the chair who will take over from me after welcoming you, Dr. Henco van der Westhuizen, and all the speakers for this day, and also the day that is coming tomorrow. Colleagues, you are more than welcome. We want to listen to all of you as we really deliberate and also having a nice conversation with our Professor Dirkie Smit on this day. And one of the things that I really appreciate is that we are celebrating a birthday with Dirkie Smit. He's a humble scholar, a father of many. And just yesterday, we celebrated one of the colleagues here in South Africa, Professor Russell Portman's birthday, of which Prof. Dirkie Smit was the first person to have a lecture, a memorial lecture of Russell Portman, who was the first Black rector at Stellenbosch University. So we want to welcome all of you. And also those who are joining us from different areas, colleagues, feel welcome. Let's listen to the scholars. Some of them are really sons who are coming from and daughters who are coming from the lectures that Prof. Dirkie Smit had in different parts of the world. So thank you so much for this opportunity that we could welcome you in style in this way. Prof. Dirkie Smit, we are really celebrating you today. One of the remarks that really makes me to really enjoy some of the lectures, I remember the day that we had hosted a conference here on Bella and Barman Declaration, the amusement that Prof. Dirkie Smit is having. It's really for us really so good. He was translating for another colleague of us who was reading the paper in German. And we laughed at that conference because we asked him to translate. He was asked to translate. Then while the colleague was reading the paper, he said, no, this is one of the moments that I don't want to do a translation because I now have to respond on this paper. So he gave a response immediately instead of giving a translation. So colleague, we really celebrate your theology. We know we are still doing well. And from the words of our colleague, Professor Dion Foster, I want to say to you, you are the gift to all of us worldwide. And we really celebrate you, but also we celebrate your theology. And at the same time, I want to borrow from the words of our dean here at the Faculty of Theology at Stellenbosch, Professor Reginald, who always remind us that we want to journey together. And at this moment, we welcome you, but we want to journey with you in this road, and our journey will ever continue. So feel welcome, colleagues, and we celebrate together Prof. Dirkie Smit. Now I'll hand over to the first chairperson for this session, Dr. Henco van der Westhuizen from the University of Free State, who will chair the first session on reconciliation, religion, and civil society. Over to you, Dr. Henco van der Westhuizen.
Good afternoon, friends, colleagues, Professor Dirkie Smit, also Professor Reginald, the Dean. It's an absolute privilege to be part of a symposium in honor of Professor Dirkie Smit on the occasion of his 70th birthday. It's an immense pleasure to chair this session on reconciliation, religion, and civil society. I will firstly introduce Dr. Demaine Solomons, and after Dr. Solomons, Myer, and after that, I will introduce MX Ashwin, Afrikaners Thyssen. I invite you to already post questions or comments for conversation whilst I introduce the next speaker, allowing me to more fluently chair this session. Firstly, welcome Dr. Demaine Solomons. Dr. Solomons grew up in Bishop Lavis and teaches systematic theology and social ethics in the Department of Religion and Theology at the University of the Western Cape. He is a Mandela Rhodes Scholar and the recipient of numerous academic awards. He is graduate of the University of the Free State, all degrees cum laude, as well as the Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam. Demaine's research encompasses moral philosophy through a Black theological lens, and his work is predicated on the notion that God suffers with humanity while also promising a better future through the hope of resurrection. Dr. Solomons, we're looking forward to your talk called On Reconciliation, What Is and What Ought to Be, Finding Meaning Amidst the Meaningless of It All.
Thank you very much, Henco, for that introduction. I know that you probably want some colleagues, to be affiliated with the University of the Free State, but I'm from the University of the Western Cape. So, yeah, but it's good to also, be part of, this community of scholars, whether, we are based at Free State or the University of the Western Cape. Thank you very much. And also, yes, Prof. Smit, Dirkie, happy birthday. The gods of aging have been very good to you, unlike some of us, where these gods are clearly fast asleep or simply have better things to do. A gentleman, allow me to be a bit old-fashioned and say that this is what I think of when reflecting on the life and the work of Dirkie Smit. Yes, of course, his excellence as a scholar of Reformed theology is well documented, a body of work celebrated the world over. Nevertheless, on every odd occasion, we are honored to be in the presence of scholars who, in a very powerful way, transcend the work that they produce. Someone who, in Aristotelian sense, is not narrowly defined by their scholarship alone, but by their humanity, their wisdom. Those of us brave enough to dare question who and what we think we are about will know that practical wisdom, properly conceived, cannot be acquired by merely learning the rules of the academic game, as it were. This helps, of course, but is not enough. We must also acquire through practice those deliberative, emotional, and social skills that enable us to put our general understanding of well-being into practice in ways that are suitable to complex environments. This is like saying, okay, so you are a good scholar, so what? However, we get a glimpse of what you are about, Dirkie, when Fritz de Lange talks about your proverbial modesty, humility, talent for friendship, moreover, your sense of humor. Again, a true gentleman. Unfortunately for me and many others, we never had the privilege of sitting in one of your classes. But then again, as a student of the University of the Western Cape, UWC, your life and work have always been a part of, you could say, the theological DNA of our institution. I say our institution because in a significant way, you can take the person out of UWC, but you will never be able to take the UWC out of the person. I say this with reference to your institutional journeys, of course. For me, it was your assessment of reconciliation in South Africa that unlocked what became a crucial aspect of my doctoral work. In the chapter, The Symbol of Reconciliation and Ideological Conflict, published in Foster's Reconciliation and Construction in 1986, you argue very convincingly that the symbol of reconciliation is deeply tied up with ideological conflict, to the extent that there is little agreement on the very meaning of the symbol of reconciliation itself. Here, one also needs to consider your doubts over the potential of reconciliation to transform society, especially during the difficult 1980s. You remind us that since it is a term that needs constant clarification, it immediately loses its power as a symbol, because a symbol is precisely something that needs no explanation, but is self-evident and immediately grips the imagination. Armed with this knowledge, the quest to come to terms with this elusive concept has kept me busy for a while, and I suspect for some time to come. In the book published a few weeks ago entitled Ecumenical Encounters with Desmond Mpulo Tutu, edited by Sarojini Nadar, Tiniko Maluleke, and others, I once again grapple with what can only be described as some of the frustrations associated with this concept. And yes, we have seen and heard it all before. In fact, some of us have grown tired of debates over the promise of reconciliation, despite being reminded that it is fundamental to developing a just society. This makes it difficult to agree on what reconciliation means, how it works, and why it is essential. If things go our way, we think of it as our most prized idea, but in times of distress, cheap deception. Behind such contestation is a longing for a South Africa that does not exist, a disparity between what is and what ought to be in a country riddled with contradictions and obscurities, an absurd state of affairs arising or responding to a system premised on the fundamental irreconcilability of people. Existentially, the quest for reconciliation emerges from the tension between our desire for order, meaning, and contentment on the one hand, and an indifferent world unwilling to provide that on the other. In this sense, reconciliation and its connection with philosophical absurdism could not be more amped, as I've argued elsewhere. This is what Albert Camus wrestled with in his famous essay, The Myth of Sisyphus. For Camus, the absurd encapsulates our human propensity to seek inherent value and meaning in the context of a chaotic, irrational, sometimes meaningless world. He compares the absurdity of life with the situation of Sisyphus, a figure in Greek mythology who is condemned to repeat the same arduous, perhaps even meaningless task of pushing a boulder up a mountain only to see it roll back down again once he reaches the summit. This sequence or metaphorical route is repeated into the realms of eternity. Driven by the desire for meaning amid meaninglessness, South Africans embarked on a journey of reconciliation. I argue a romantic pursuit for a new way of being in the aftermath of the absurdity of apartheid. It was an audacious plan, setting in motion a chain of events that culminated in what became the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a process for better or worse, etching the dream of reconciliation in the hearts and minds of the people of this country. And at the center of the TRC stood people like Archbishop Desmond Tutu, its charismatic chairperson. Tutu and his colleagues, many of whom were Christian leaders, were tasked to breathe life into one of our most contested terms. Not only was the notion and practice of reconciliation tied up with ideological conflict, but doubts concerning its potential to transform society remains an ever-present reality, as you've argued, Professor Smit. In Reconciliation, a guiding vision for South Africa, Ernst Conradi makes the point that reconciliation and its contestation cannot be separated from the influence of Christianity in South Africa. This should be understood in terms of the allegiance of Christianity in the country, the centrality of reconciliation in Christian soteriology, and the significance of what is aptly described as the church struggle against apartheid. Reconciliation was at the very center of the struggle, challenging both the politics and theology of racial separation. Among other things, this is evident in the message to the people of South Africa, the Bella Confession, the National Initiative for Reconciliation, and also in 1990, the Rustenburg Declaration. We also know that the term elicited much controversy in the Kairos document, where the emphasis on reconciliation was severely criticized as a form of church theology, a theology of reconciliation considered cheap or inauthentic. Turning again to the TRC, Dirkie, it is with deep appreciation that you write about Archbishop Tutu, the centrality of theology, moreover, the ways in which theology permeated the TRC process, is something that strikes a chord, not just in narrow academic terms, but in ways that speak to our fragility as people. You write that Tutu and others were appalled at the depth of human depravity to which human beings could sink, to the extent where they were tempted to say that those who committed atrocities were monsters because the deeds were monstrous. However, theology prevented them from doing so. In your words, and I quote, theology reminded them that however diabolical the acts, they did not turn to the perpetrators or turn the perpetrators into demons. Theology reminded them to discern between act and person and to remain filled with compassion for persons. The point, Tutu said, is that if perpetrators were to be despaired of as monsters and demons, then they were no longer responsible as moral agents. And more importantly, that would mean that all hope would have been abandoned of their being able to change. Theology, Tutu said, reminded them that even the wretched remains children of God with the possibility to repent and to change, end quote. With God, Tutu reminded you and all of us that we may never think that it is too late. We may never give up on anyone because God has a particularly soft spot for those in sin, for what you call the scum and the dregs and those on the fringes. I'm not sure where you stand today, Dirkie, thinking about it now, Tutu's conception of reconciliation was bound to be at odds with popular ideas of the time, whether by those who support or reject the idea of the irreconcilability of people. Remembering that the need for reconciliation appears in the face of violence, rendering its quest hostile to itself. Unfortunately, in such instances as with the Kairos document and later the TRC, a pattern of binary thinking emerges where dilemmas are often oversimplified to arrive at convenient answers, rendering nuances less than obvious. Here we tend to emphasize the things we agree with and avoid that which contradicts our position. Elsewhere, I categorize such quandaries, including the quest for reconciliation, as a wicked problem, since the many variables associated with the concept are often ignored for ideological alignment. With Tutu, and I see a similar progression in your own work, reconciliation proceeds from a state of kenosis, a word derived from the Greek word kinao, found in Philippians 2, meaning to empty, describing God's act of self-emptying through the incarnation. More broadly, the Christian doctrine of incarnation speaks to the very specific act of God's interaction with the world through Christ. With this at the forefront of our thinking, the kenosis of God in Christ becomes the ethical or philosophical mode through which Christian leadership is or should be expressed. Bella. Adequately understood, kenosis requires one to transcend narrow self-interest to locate the other in the mutuality of love. This leads one to locate the other in their mutual humanity, a communal redefinition of what it means to be human, founded on self-sacrificial love. Building on the doctrinal tenets of the incarnation, this understanding of kenosis becomes the foundation on which the Christian faith is based. No wonder you remind us that the Christian church has naturally been in the business of truth and reconciliation, guilt and forgiveness from its very beginnings. You even state that this is our reason for our existence, our job, the industry we work in. This, of course, was in sharp contrast to the logic of apartheid, turning the assumption of the fundamental irreconcilability of people on its head. Instead, the restoration of friendship and the realization of the need to make amends for wrongs committed took center stage. Flowing from this, reconciliation becomes the pivot, a kenotic form of love that acknowledges the unity and diversity of peoples and their interdependence, irrespective of the social markers that separate them. God's act of self-emptying, an undeserved act of love, becomes the basis on which the liberation and reconciliation of black and white compatriots are established. In accepting the social and cultural locality, reconciliation's potential is given new meaning. And Dirkie, if you allow me to be completely honest, I do not think society, the church, nor the academy has scored on to this. At best, like many things in this beautiful country of ours, we occupy ourselves with the banal, debating whether certain attempts at reconciliation should be considered cheap or costly. Nearing 3 decades after the TRC first started its work, the quest for reconciliation remains as elusive as ever. Under these circumstances, one would have to once again reconsider, as you did in the 1980s, whether indeed reconciliation has the potential to transform society. The arduousness of this ideal continues to baffle those looking for quick answers to a complex, wicked problem. In this sense, I maintain that the quest for reconciliation has in some ways become an exercise in the absurd, since there is no rational or succinct way of capturing exactly what is at stake. While there may well be consensus on what reconciliation entails, controversies over how this ideal is to be realized suggest conflicting interpretation of its value and meaning. It is something that transcends our ability or urge for mastery, and is therefore best described as an elusive mystery, a dream that cannot be fathomed or achieved. This is amidst our propensity to forever search for meaning, irrespective of the incongruity of the ideal and the absurdity that defines our chaotic, irrational, and sometimes meaningless existence. In our brokenness, reconciliation is the audacity to dream of something beyond the meaningless that sometimes defines us or defines our existence. Moreover, invoking its theological roots to achieve something extraordinary, resisting the temptation of utter hopelessness. In this context, Camus' conception of the absurd provides a glimmer of hope. It is a stark reminder that our efforts may very well be futile, but that we should endure nevertheless. And like Sisyphus, we are charged to roll a boulder up a mountain only to see it roll down again, over and over again. In doing so, we should cope as best we can with whatever challenges come our way, embracing the absurd background of our existence. In other words, or in the words of Camus, now quote, each atom of that stone, each mineral flake of that night-filled mountain in itself forms a world. The struggle itself towards the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. And here comes the punchline. One must imagine Sisyphus happy, end quote. This is a constant reminder of why some difficulties are worth enduring in a world that is as precarious and unsettling as ours. This diagnosis is not a fatality. The absurdity of our situation is our reality, but love saves us from it. The paradoxical presence of meaning amid meaninglessness. Perhaps this is the one thing we should learn from your many contributions and your life and work, Professor Smit. We salute you, Grootman. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Solomons. Very often a prophet do not know when he or she is a prophet. And maybe saying that you're from the Free State is just such a comment. I'm sorry for that. Ella Myer, I have the privilege to introduce her. Ella, next, is a doctoral student in Emory University's Graduate Division of Religion. Her course of study is Ethics and Society. Myer's work focuses on the intersection of religion, memory studies, and philosophy of history. Her writing has appeared in the Journal of the History of Ideas blog. Prior to her doctoral studies, Myer worked as an intercultural education coordinator and human rights educator in Lithuania for 4 years. She has been a sought-after guest speaker and workshop facilitator in both university and community settings on topics of intercultural communication. Myer received a Master of Divinity from Princeton Theological Seminary, where she completed her thesis, Untimely Audit, Nietzsche, Princeton Seminary, and the Painful, Unjust Past, under the direction of Professor Dirkie Smit. The title of her talk will be Queer Monumentality, the Power of Symbolic Form. Welcome, Ella Myer.
Thank you. Thanks so much for that, Henco. Before I read my paper, I just want to say happy birthday, Professor Smit, and thank you so much, everyone, for having me. I'm gonna get my timer, I think. Professor Smit's articles for our section this morning prompted me to reflect more deeply on the nature and power of symbols. Smit shows how symbols play important roles in the social construction of reality, and how we need symbols for reality to be legible to us. He also shows how new or reinterpreted symbols can lead to revolutionary change, or simply reflect that transformation has already occurred. Furthermore, Smit's careful analysis demonstrates that it is not so easy to harness or manufacture symbolic power. For example, South African theologians cannot simply theorize and promote reconciliation as the symbol to help transform and bring together the majority of South Africans. In his 1986 article for our session, Smit doubted that this symbol would be strong enough, nonpartisan enough, appealing enough, or even clear enough for people from different ideological perspectives to be successful. And in his 2017 article for this morning, we see that it ultimately was not, despite the Herculean efforts of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. In my own work, I am most interested in symbols that are connected to the past. I am interested in how monuments and discourses about the past function, not just as signs of what happened, but are turned into symbols that represent a community's bigger truths, beliefs, values, and goals. I'm also interested in the specific form or medium of such symbols. Professor Smit might refer to this as the, quote, style of rhetoric through which a symbol is communicated. While I was at Princeton, I completed my thesis under Professor Smit on Princeton's historical audit on slavery, which had recently been released. Since moving to Atlanta, I've continued to follow PTS's reckoning with its past, with its attempt to, quote, tell the truth and move toward reconciliation. Most recently, last week even, this has taken the shape of naming Princeton's library after Theodore Cedric Wright, the seminary's first African-American graduate and a remarkable abolitionist. My research here at Emory has focused on two other case studies: Confederate monuments in Atlanta and the symbolic representation of LGBTQ history in this country. I focus here on the latter because I imagine my audience might be less familiar with it, and because it might be helpful to add gender and sexuality to our discussions about symbols, rather than another case study dominated by racial concerns. Although, as Queer of Color critique tells us, gender and sexuality are always partially constituted by race, and vice versa. So something surprising started to happen 35 years ago in how queer history was represented in this country. And at this point, I should say that I will be using LGBTQ and queer interchangeably in this essay. The veritable sea change that occurred was the emergence of queer monumentality as a new medium for queer history. Within this new rhetorical form, new power-laden symbols also emerged. In this paper, I ask, what is the history of this surprising change? What are the benefits and dangers of queer monumentality as a medium or a form? Is the language of reconciliation a part of the content of queer monumentality? I'll close by asking, does queer monumentality show up in churches and at seminaries like PTS? Should it? Professor Smit's analysis of symbols serves as my dialogue partner. Since he does not discuss the monumental as a form in these essays, however, I will have to go beyond his texts, using his work as springboard and inspiration. LGBTQ Americans have long faced challenges around the preservation and representation of their pasts. In fact, cis heteronormative people and systems have found in memory and history discourses unique ways to promote cis heterosexual power and subjugate queer people. For example, between the late 19th and the late 20th centuries, cis heterosexuality was powerfully reinforced by the portrayal of the American past as an unquestionably straight, cis place. Countless queer lives were forcibly forgotten during these years because it was dangerous to write down queer desire, because it was common for the queer archival material that was written down or preserved to be destroyed or distorted, and because the standards of proof around describing a historical figure as LGBTQ were made almost unreachable. Despite these overwhelming obstacles, queer people found ways to preserve and draw strength and meaning from their pasts. According to Thomas Dunn, the leading scholar of queer memory, the memory rhetorics that LGBTQ Americans employed between 1870 and 1980 were, quote, tactical in aim and ephemeral in form. Tactical here refers to Michel de Certeau's theories of how those not in control of the social terrain must subvert it for their needs, even if only temporarily. Ephemeral refers to what queer theorist Jose Munoz calls the ability to evaporate at a touch. Allow me to provide several examples of how queer history was represented in tactical and ephemeral ways. First, within LGBTQ communities, people pass down histories to each other through intergenerational storytelling, novels, myths, gossip, innuendo, and coded fleeting performances that only those people within the queer epistemological sphere could understand. The symbols that came out of these ways of maintaining a relationship with the past strengthened community identity, empowered people to affirm themselves, and helped to render legible reality outside of the norm. What is especially interesting about these symbols for our purposes is how they contradict Smith's claim that powerful symbols do not need to be explained. In this case, the fact that these symbols were not clear, required explanation, and were able to disappear were their strengths. Their veiled, ephemeral nature helped ensure that their content, as well as their bearers, survived in the face of forces that would eradicate them. When outside of LGBTQ communities, historical bricolage was one of the most common tactical and ephemeral ways that queer people tapped history's symbolic power. Many queer people took whatever was available in cis heterosexual history and redirected it to different ends. Playwright Oscar Wilde's trial in 1895 for gross indecency provides a clear example. To defend himself, Wilde argued that many revered figures in history were like him. Plato, David and Jonathan, and Shakespeare, he says, all shared in the love that dare not speak its name. Other LGBTQ people took part in historical speculations like this as well, as is evident from the copious notes of psychotherapists. Since cis heterosexual society had an investment in, and therefore a claim on, many of these historical figures, however, queer people could not hold on to them or their symbolic power for long. This reality powerfully illustrates Smith's observation that once one group claims a symbol, it is hard for other groups to successfully use it. So historical bricolage worked only as fleeting survival tactic and not as solid foundation. The sea change in the symbolic representations of LGBTQ pasts began in the 1980s. During this time, queer people began to build stone monuments to known and not speculated queer people, and to have some success placing them on the landscape. During the 1990s, they also began constructing other monumental memory discourses. For example, queer people turned the memory of the murder of one obscure gay college student, Matthew Shepard, into an enduring, nationally known, rhetorically powerful symbol for hate crime legislation. And in California, queer activists began to petition for the inclusion of LGBTQ people into some of the most monumental transmitters of history in this country, high school textbooks. During the Obama years, the government even began to lend some support to queer monumentality. For example, the area around the Stonewall Inn in New York City was designated the first LGBTQ national monument in 2016. But perhaps I've gotten ahead of myself. What do I mean by monumental anyway? As my examples show, monumental and monumentality are not synonymous with monument, as in stone sculpture. To say something is monumental means that it has a weightiness, a timelessness, a grandeur to it. Monumental things also intend to impinge on or call out to those who behold them. They proclaim a message and urge others to join them in promoting it. They appeal primarily to rationality, not to rationality, a la Habermas, but to affect instead. They are built on the insight, as Smit writes, that, quote, people normally do not change by way of rational argument or self-critical analysis. Allow me to highlight 2 reasons queer monumentality emerged in the 1980s. First, the AIDS crisis led to an increased urgency to durably record queer history and to publicly advocate for queer lives. Second, at this time, monumentality was not in fashion. Due to the ideological conflicts of the 20th century, many people viewed it as a problematic form at best and totalitarian at worst. So since the grip of cis-heteronormative society on monumentality weakened, LGBTQ people were able to access it and begin the task of crafting new, powerful symbols through it. Monumentality was appealing to queer people for several reasons. First, it could provide durability in the face of the drive to forget and render invisible queer pasts. Second, it could ascribe queer people honor in the face of discourses that name queerness perversion and inherently anti-citizen. Third, it could provide inspiration and persuasive appeal to the struggle for rights. And fourth, it could create a source of power not dependent on subverting cis-straight histories. I would be remiss if I did not mention the dangers, and there are many, that queer people faced in grasping onto monumentality. One of the most significant is that monumentality, which tends to be rigid and unitary, runs the risk of ironically creating a new normativity for a community partially defined by its rejection of norms, a homonormativity, if you will. And the fact is that most queer monuments are of white, gay, cisgender men. In the quest for rights or acceptance, the wealthier, more palatable queers have left others behind. Is this why Matthew Shepard could successfully be made into a hate crime symbol while dozens of trans women of color who are murdered every year are not? If we speak about monumental sculptures, we must also ask whether the form is fundamentally too tainted to be used. Historically speaking, female sculptures are much more frequently allegories than real women. And this month, Monument Lab published a report showing that there are more monuments to mermaids in this country than to US congresswomen. Even more concerning, classical sculpture played an active role in forwarding white supremacy. So can it portray Black and brown LGBTQ people positively? This line of thought therefore makes me want to ask Professor Smit to expand his thoughts on the importance of using the correct kind of rhetoric whenever forwarding a new symbol. What is the role of ethics and not merely persuasive ability whenever forwarding a new symbol? Now I'd like to spend a moment on the content of queer monumentality. Since queer people have been egregiously wronged and cast out in America, do we see the language of reconciliation in queer monuments? Overall, no. Perhaps this is because reconciliation has yet to have much purchase in American society in general around any of America's wrongs. I would suggest more deeply, however, that this lack of reconciliation language is because the government's support is often needed to access monumentality. And this typically means that queer people must acquiesce to American nationalism. In this schema, the only way for LGBTQ people to make it into history textbooks or to have their sculptures legally placed on public land is if the harms done to queer people are minimized. And only those queer people who contributed to the American National Project are included. All those LGBTQ people who were terrorized by the American nation or who revolted against it are forgotten. To close, I would like to think briefly about the church and about PTS. Unlike wider society, queer people and their allies do use reconciliation language within Christian churches. I'm thinking here about the ELCA Lutherans' Reconciling in Christ movement and the Methodists' Reconciling Ministries. Since I'm Lutheran, I know more about the former. Starting in 1974, Reconciling in Christ is the designation that LGBTQ affirming Lutheran churches and organizations can receive if they complete an extensive study of queer issues and scripture, and then publish a fully affirming welcome statement. As of today, almost 1,000 Lutheran communities have received this designation, and close to 400 are in the process. I would say this counts as a monumental endeavor. It would be interesting to study this material in more depth to see what role queer history plays in the curriculum, which I hope to do in the future. Finally, at PTS, I currently do not see any movement from the administration to confront its history of cis heteronormativity or to include queer graduates in its symbolics. As a former board member of Princeton's Gender and Sexuality Association for Seminarians, GSAS, formerly BGLAS, I can share that a lot of queer history at PTS has been passed down through word of mouth. Although recently some research has been more formally done by queer alumni, and GSAS is sponsoring an LGBTQ history event at the end of this month. Should the queer PTS students seek to obtain queer monumentality at Princeton? Will a known queer student ever have applied to them the rhetorics of reconciliation and honor that were applied to Theodore Cedric Wright in naming the second largest theological library in the world after him? Would pursuing the creation of monumental symbolics like this be the most powerful, let alone most ethical course of action? I leave these questions open for Professor Smit, for our group discussion, and for the consideration of those queer students who currently grace PTS's campus. I also eagerly await to hear from those of you outside of Princeton and the United States. Is queer monumentality present in your context? What dilemmas around symbolic form do you face? Thank you.
Thank you, Ella. Next, I introduce MX Ashwin Afrikaners Thyssen. Ashwin is a junior lecturer in church polity and church history at Stellenbosch University's Faculty of Theology in the Department of Systematic Theology and Ecclesiology. At present, Thyssen's research interests in the intersection of religion and law, to Stellenbosch and adaptation. Thank you, Ashwin.
Greetings, friends, greetings, colleagues. Through the chair of the session, Dr. Henco van der Westhuizen, extend me the gift of saying that all protocol has been observed. It is, of course, an immense honor to share the space with you in Prof. Dirkie Smit. Veels geluk, mag jy opnuut die vreugde en troos van genade ervaar. For our time together, I'll be reflecting on the title From Belhar to Stellenbosch, considering Dirkie Smit's reconciliation as admission and invitation. My contribution then is structured in three parts. First, I present a consideration of Belhar as an admission concerning reconciliation. And then second, I offer a thought on Stellenbosch as an invitation to reconciliation. Finally, in the third part, I consider the reality that we must navigate a public of irreconcilable differences. And Demaine has, in some sense, alluded to this for me to some degree. So friends, a brief note on my relationship with Smit's work might be helpful. I, unlike many participating in the symposium, was not taught by Professor Smit except for, well, perhaps 3 weeks in 2015 in my first year. So meaning my encounter with Smit has always been through mediation, informed by my encounter has always been informed by the mediation of lecturers who have now become my colleagues. And I think when I encounter Smit, I'm always reminded of a visionary, one who is pointing us to that which is yet to be. I'm also thinking now of Dr. Sipho Mahokoto, who said that Professor Smit is a father. Now, if he must be a father to someone like Robert, then to me, he must be a grandfather. So of late, in the attempt to figure out on which intellectual terrain I would erect my theological tent, I found Smit most helpful. In one of his columns, Smit writes, and for the purpose of time, I'll be reading the English, hope is almost impossible in a yes we can atmosphere. Hope, after all, is born in the dark, It is to keep trusting despite, in spite of, nevertheless. Inspired by this conception of hope, I soon found myself immersed in queer theory and queer theology. And right now I find myself arrested by Jose Esteban Munoz's vision of the term queer. He states, and I quote, "Queerness is not yet here. Queerness is an ideality. Put another way, we are not yet queer. We may never touch queerness, but we can feel it as the warm illumination of a horizon imbued with potentiality. We have never been queer, yet queerness exists for us as an ideality that can be distilled from the past used to imagine a future. The future is queerness's domain. Queerness is a structuring and educated mode of desiring that allows us to see and feel beyond the quagmire of the present," end quote. This understanding of queerness as the untouchable horizon of what is not yet is how I propose we understand Smith's idea of reconciliation. Please note, I'm not suggesting that Smith's conception of reconciliation is a form of this ideality. Rather, I contend that reconciliation is the tool used to point us to the horizon. Heeding Smith's pointing to the future, it is needful that we return to the past. And so we go to Belhar and we return to Stellenbosch. In the 1980s, the town of Belhar in the city of Cape Town caught the attention not only of South Africa, but also the world. Belhar, of course, is the product of apartheid spatial planning. It is the result of the forced removal of Black colored people from Cape Town CBD. Belhar is also where the University of the Western Cape is housed. What caught the attention of the world in the 1980s was the adoption of the Belhar Confession by the Dutch Reformed Mission Church. It is this locality, the immediate context, that birthed the Belhar Confession. And of course, as you are aware, Smit played an important role in the adoption of the confession. Blaikison van Huffel informs us, and I quote, "The commission entrusted the young Dirkie Smit to draft a document because most of them were engaged in commission work during the synod," end quote. And so I'm not claiming that Smit is solely responsible for the formulation of the Belhar Confession. Rather, I argue that the confession, its drafting and adoption, has influenced his later theological development. Reflecting on the Belhar Confession in conversation with the Barman Declaration, Smit raises the question regarding the faith that informs how we are to live together as historically separated churches, as structurally divided society. For him, this living together must grapple seriously with ethics and with public witness. And we, of course, know that for Smit, reconciliation is a symbol that may be able to respond to ideological conflict. The Belhar Confession, as well as Smith's early theology, requires that we admit, and this is Belhar's admission, that we admit that reconciliation may just be a helpful tool to bring about transformation. This reconciliation, Busak reminds us, is not the torturous logic that offers the perpetrator the comfort and protection of victimhood while denying the victim the freedom of anger and the protection of solidarity. In our time, we must, like Smith, set out for conceptual clarity regarding reconciliation, both its promise and its pitfall. So that is Belhar's admission that reconciliation is an imperative. In 1994, Smith moved to Stellenbosch University from Belhar. In my estimation, this date, 1994, and this move presented a decisive shift in Smith's thinking, and no doubt that of the entire South African Theological Academy. From this point on, Smith would develop the project of public theology. Like the town of Belhar, Stellenbosch is also marked by racial segregation. Still, the impact of economic apartheid is perhaps most palpable in this Cape Winelands town. Stellenbosch's town center is the playground, friends, of those who enjoy privilege and are upwardly mobile, whereas its periphery, places like Cluttersville, Eidersville, and Kayamandi, they are marked by conditions of precarity. Moreover, Stellenbosch University, of course, is the point of origin for the doctrine of apartheid and Afrikaner nationalism, the preserve of the Dutch Reformed Church. In essence then, for many Black people, it is the symbol of Afrikaner hegemony, and this is the reality even today. Stellenbosch, therefore, unmasks the prevailing horror of apartheid and spatial planning. Setting forth to develop the project of public theology here at Stellenbosch, Smit decisively drew the theological school into dialogue with the material conditions that shape the lives of those on the periphery. Partnering with others, Smit shaped the space in which dialogue could take place amongst the publics. In time, this dialogical commitment would result in the launching of the Beursnodeer Center for Public Theology. Celebrating 150 years since the founding of the Dutch Reformed Church Seminary at Stellenbosch, the former Dean, Elmer Ton, and for the purpose of time, I'm again going to translate, writes as follows: on the road between memory and hope, such an institution chooses to give priority to the possibility of God's reforming, healing love and grace above the reality of brokenness of our world. From Maton's words, then, it may be observed that Stellenbosch has changed and transformed since supporting the development and implementation of apartheid. It is at this Stellenbosch, I posit, that we are to take Smit's invitation to do the work of reconciliation seriously. Differently put, for me, this work is the project of public theology, the doing of and the conceiving of reconciliation in a form that is accountable to the church, the academy, and society. And that, I think, friends, is Stellenbosch's invitation. So up to this point, I have offered Belhar and Stellenbosch as helpful keys to understanding Smit's conception of reconciliation. Now, in brief, I note the challenges that public theology in South Africa must respond to if it is to take reconciliation seriously. And I suspect that my suspicion is that these challenges are not only the sole preserve of South Africa, but also impact how public theology is conceived globally. Three factors, I think, pose a challenge to the contemporary exploration of reconciliation. The first is the rise of right-wing populism. The second, the endemic prevalence of violence. And then third, public theology's present preoccupation. I do not have much time, so I think the first being right-wing populism. And this form, this brand of politics, I think, is aggressive, it is racist, it is misogynistic, and socially conservative. In short, right-wing populism reduces political debate to nothing but rebuttals and renders the public irreconcilable. So that being the first. The second is that of violence. And in South Africa, Maluleke, according to Maluleke, violence in South Africa takes two rather prevalent forms. And to this, I add a third. The first is violence directed at the precarious class of workers. Second, the prevailing femicide and gender-based violence. And then third, violence directed at people who are LGBTI+, being sexual and gender minorities. So these two are the problems that I think we really need to think about when doing public theology. But then the third, informed by this discussion, any conception of reconciliation must grapple earnestly with these realities. The public of the society we have before us, I argue, is one of irreconcilable differences. Today, we are 25 years after the launch of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and since then, much has changed. On the theological landscape, we have witnessed the ascendancy of public theology. Some months ago, the theologian Tinyuko Maluleke offered a scathing yet helpful and constructive critique of public theology, arguing why he does not identify with the term. In this critique, Maluleke writes, and I quote, "In my view, the time has come for Christianity in Africa to not merely be a prop for European and American Christianity, which masquerade as normative Christianity and to not merely provide illustrations and anecdotes that prop up global public theology. Instead, the time has come for Christianity in Africa to speak in its own name and assert its right to be. decades after the TRC, and particularly after the student protests of 2015, 2016, which critiqued the prevailing logic of coloniality in South Africa, we must admit that public theology has thus far been limited in taking a decolonial stance. For this reason, I think we must go beyond where Smit has been able to. This beyond is the very horizon of a decolonial future. In like fashion, public theology must be critiqued for its inability to draw on feminist and womanist intellectual frameworks. As such, like Esther McIntosh, I have much concern that the project remains dominated by men, not least white men from the global north. So while I offer this assessment of public theology and to some degree affirm Maluleke's critique, I am not entirely hopeless. In fact, my interest in making a contribution to public theology is informed by Smit's recognition of his positionality. Conceiving of reconciliation in the manner that he has at UWC and at Stellenbosch, Smit reminds us that reconciliation allows us to see the horizon that much better. Understanding public theology as foundationally concerned with reconciliation, I agree with Smit that public theology is a visionary and normative project seeking to take a position to make a difference, to serve that which matters. Serving that which matters in our time is the public of irreconcilable differences that we have inherited. This public in which right-wing populism and violence is rife. By way of conclusion, engaging Smit, we are confronted with Belhar's admission and Stellenbosch's invitation. Belhar, both in geographical location and confessional document, require that we admit that reconciliation is an imperative. And Stellenbosch, both the geographical location and its theological school, extend to us the invitation that the work of reconciliation is uncomfortable. At the start, I noted that my encounter with Smit has been primarily through mediation. Afford me then the opportunity to return to this thought. Encountering Smit through people like Robert Vosloo, Rothney Chaka, and Ari Marais, to number 3, I was time and again invited to do theology while fully cognizant of my positionality. Because of these encounters, I'm encouraged to do theology with an awareness of my Blackness and an awareness of my queerness. Finally, a thought on Professor Smit. In the Belhar Confession, the Church affirms that it must stand where God stands, with the oppressed and destitute, with the victims and survivors of human rights abuses, with those on the underside of history. Because of Smit's development of reconciliation and as a visionary, I argue that he has taken his stand with God. During his time at Belhar, at UWC, Smit reminded us to admit that reconciliation is absolutely essential. And further, while at Stellenbosch, he invited us into the space of difficulty and discomfort in doing the work of reconciliation in service of the church and society. Reading Smit in this manner, we find that he is standing alongside Emmanuel Katongole, where God is in fact standing, recognizing that reconciliation is both a gift and an invitation. Paraphrasing Munoz, I argue that Smit is pointing us to the horizon, reminding us justice is not yet here. We are only illumined by it, for it is the future's domain. Sol Justitia illustra nos. The sun of justice illuminates us. Kai Gangans, thank you very much.
Thank you, Ashwin, and thanks again to Demaine and Ella. We are now opening up the conversation. We have about 25, 26 minutes before we take a break. So we ask that you please post your questions in the chat or in the Q&A, and please direct them either to all of the speakers or to Demaine, Ella, or Ashwin. While we wait, we have a lot of thank yous already. So Rajini says to Ashwin, glad you evoked Maluleke here. Such an important intervention to the public theology debate. Chris Lombard says, very smart, encouraging and inspiring opening statements by Demaine, Ella, and Ashwin. Any questions and comments? Welcome to the speakers. Tanya, do you have a question? I see you say you cannot type in the Q&A, so type it there.
Yes, I don't know if I'm visible. My voice is because we were only supposed to use the Q&A and the questions in the, the typing, but I tried to use the Q&A and chat now, and I can't type in a question. So I'm actually wondering if maybe someone else is having the same problem, and I don't want to hog the session, but while there aren't any other questions, I can type my question in the chat box in the meantime, and then give others a chance as not to speak in the session. Otherwise, I will just ask my question. It's up to you, Henco.
You're welcome to ask your question while we wait for the others.
Okay.
So please raise your hand if you have a question, and we'll try and unmute you.
Okay, great. So I see Sipho's got the same issue. So in the meantime, my question is directed to Dr. Ella. In terms of the whole thing about symbolism and how the LGBTI community and the discourse and gender around that. So I'm just wondering if she talks about monuments and what monuments might symbolize specifically in her community. I'm interested if something like who is on the bill of a $20 bill, or whose face is on a piece of money, which represents a type of power in a community. If that is for you very much linked to what you would understand, for example, as a monument. And I know there was a rather large ongoing discussion about getting someone to be on the $20 bill of the States. And if you would maybe just make a few comments on that regarding if that is also a type of symbolism or a monument in that regard, which would link to something like a recognition and reconciliation. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you so much for your question, Tanya. Absolutely. I think the people whose faces are on our money is a form of monumentality. So recall I make a distinction between a monument, like a physical sculpture, and monumentality as an idea, as a larger form of rhetoric that communicates. So I think if we were to talk about who goes on our money, that would have all of the same ethical concerns that I had with using monumentality in general about that's definitely something that's owned by the state and connected with American nationalism. And so queer people in the United States have had a lot of, they've been rendered criminal anti-nationals by this nation. And so there are some, historically speaking, some questions around whether or not that would be the best way to go about gaining symbolic power, gaining representation of their histories in the public sphere and moving towards goals of rights and for some people acceptance. In terms of reconciliation, I'm not sure. I think for some it could hold that potential, but for other members of the queer community, it would be a very disturbing, I think, form to engage with. But you're right, also in the United States, there are I think every single person on paper money is a white man, and only a few coins are there women, and that would be a bigger discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Ella. So Rajini says, thank you, Ella and Ashwin, for amplifying gender and sexuality within the discourses of reconciliation and for foregrounding the intersectionality of race, religion, and sexuality. Dion says, thank you very much, deeply challenging. And Hannah, I see your hand. You are welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, all three of you. I really enjoyed all the three talks a lot. And I have so many thoughts. I just want to direct a quick question, or maybe just a follow-up to Ashwin, if I may. I love particularly your connection to Munoz. I think he's a really underrated theological thinker. So I really loved your pulling him into this conversation here. And I'm just intrigued. I totally, I was compelled by your point that for the need of moving beyond certain Eurocentric frameworks in public theology. And so I'm just intrigued to hear a little bit more concretely, right? What you envision this new and different version of public theology to look like theologically, that takes into account or that draws more strongly, right, on decolonial, feminist, womanist, queer thought. What would that look like theologically? What changes, right? Rather than just we invoke different names, or maybe we look at different constituencies. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for that question, Hannah. So I'm keeping it in my own mind. I'm keeping this an open question because I don't think that I do have an adequate answer to this. So I'm keeping where public theology could go an open question. Personally, because I'm a Black theologian as well, I draw on Black theology. I allow that to inform how I do public theology. And then also, I particularly draw on the late South African theologian, Vuyani Willem, who really challenges how we conceive public theology and also the limits of Black theology. So that's where I'm seeing the direction going, sort of having an open conversation that recognizes the various forms of public as conceived by public theology. And of course, yeah, I'm always challenged by Rothny Chaka on this, who always asks us the question, who's public? When white men theologians in South Africa are the ones doing public theology, whose public are they referring to? Are they referring to those whose lives are marked by violence, or are they referring to those who I've said, who Stellenbosch Town Centre is playground? So that's where I'm currently going. I'm drawing on Black theology and queer theology to do public theology.
Hannah, do you have a follow-up?
Yes, if I may, that sounds like also a great possibility to connect your thoughts with Ella's. I love that challenging question, the who's public. And I really enjoyed, Ella, also like your critical remarks of whether always kind of the aspiration of the widest public possible is the most helpful choice, and how we mediate between, right, the interest in having an effect, and also the need for protection, or also like just different kinds of messages and celebration and construction, depending on where we draw the boundary of the community that we're trying to reach. So I wonder if the two of you want to just enter in conversation here. I would love that.
Ella, if you go first, if you don't mind.
Okay. I'm not sure what to say. I definitely enjoyed Ashwin's comments. The second that he mentioned Munoz and queer thought, I was like, oh, thank goodness. I didn't know if I would be the only one in this section on that. I also appreciated Ashwin's work because you see a different side of the word queer. You know, I faced some challenges within my own work about whether queer refers to identity category or whether it's a theoretical, anti-normative, open horizon stance. And so within mine, it was more focused on identity categories. And within Ashwin's, it seems it was more queer theory based. And something I didn't mention in my talk was, if we want to think about how to maybe more ethically do queer monumentality in civil society or within the church, incorporating queer theory into the types of monuments and monumentality discourses that happen is one way to, I think, make it more ethical. So bringing in that the anti-normative critical discourses that's present within queer theory and queer theology. So I would like to bring together what part of what Ashwin was saying with what I was saying.
Ashwin, if you would like to come in before our next question to both you and Demaine.
Thank you, Henco. I just have one question, because one of the things that struck me with your presentation, Ella, is in your vision of the queer utopia, because that is the task of every queer, is to imagine a queer utopia. Do you see need for monumentality? Because that was one of the things I'm struggling with. We all have our intellectuals that we draw on, and we, in some sense, create them to be monuments to which we look towards for guidance. Do you, in your imagining of the queer utopia, do you see the need for forms of monumentality?
That's a great question. I think it depends on what horizon we're currently at. I would say right now, yes, but a revised form, perhaps not further in the future, towards what, I mean, I also have serious questions about utopian thinking, but I think I mentioned in my work, what are the benefits that queer people see in using monumentality? And they are significant. If queer lives have been completely erased from historical discourse, durability is important. And if queer lives have been maligned and literally eradicated, then it's applying honor and these things that are within monumentality has some very clear benefits. But I think it would have to be more local goals for me and not an ultimate thing, because the problems with monumentality are well documented. And I think we might need to go to the next question, but maybe I can email you sometime about your criticism of monumentality. I would love to hear that.
There might be time to get back to that. Demaine, I'll give you the question first. So Rajini asks, can Bella ever really, theologically and otherwise, ever reconcile with Stellenbosch?
Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you for that question, Professor Nadar. I think when I think Stellenbosch is more than just a place, right? It's also a symbol of something, I think, for many South Africans. Of course, one of the things that comes to mind is, the history of Stellenbosch and a history of white supremacy. So it's not just about the location Stellenbosch, which is, that comes to mind when thinking about it. And of course, in sharp contrast, you have Bella, which is, you could say, the antithesis of a place like Stellenbosch, given the realities of what places like Bella or the Bontewils or the Khayelitsas of this world is about. So whether those can be reconciled, given the reality, if you go according to the Gini coefficient, South Africa being the most unequal country in the world, of course, there's no way you can reconcile that unless you address the structural issues that is always at play when thinking about South Africa. When friends from overseas ask me about South Africa, and I always ask them, what South Africa are you talking about? Because in a way, I come from, both South Africans. I happen to enjoy some of the joys and the nice things about South Africa now, given my positionality as an academic. But at the same time, I'm also from Bishop Lavis, who have to confront the realities of the things people need to go through there on a daily basis. A place where my family still is. So again, I find it difficult to reconcile my reality now with my with where I come from. So, and to a large extent, that is the South Africa that I think to a large extent for me, that's everything that is wrong with, the country that we love dearly. And in the same way, I think just latching on to Ashwin's earlier comment around Stellenbosch, I mean, which Stellenbosch are we talking about? Are we talking about Clutersville or are we talking about Kayamandi? So given where we are today, Professor Nadar, I mean, it's very difficult for me to find ways of connecting the dots between the winelands and the ghettos of the Cape Flats. You know, that's just how I see it in a way, which is, yeah, good question. Yeah.
Thanks, Demaine. I'll give to Ashwin and then go to the chat box so long for a question from Chris Lombard. Ashwin, you are welcome to.
Thank you.
On that
So in short, my response to that, Professor Nadar, is no. I don't think so. What would for Belhar, both the confessional document and Belhar, the geographic location, for that and Stellenbosch to reconcile would require, in my estimation, class suicide and racial suicide. It would require for white people to be reborn as Black people in South Africa, to let go of their whiteness. And at this point in time, I'm not yet convinced that the majority of the people who reside in Stellenbosch are willing to let go of that. And I also think that it would require for theologians who navigate Stellenbosch, who call this their intellectual home, it would require of them to take Black theology and the critique that Black theology has to offer and womanist thought, to take that critique much more seriously. And I'm saying this in the following way, because what we have in South Africa right now is we have the rise to power of people who are Black, who are melanated people. And the rise to power has meant that we, in some sense, we move the levers of power. We have access and we have agency. But just because we have agency, it has not meant, and has not always translated in ease of access for people who have been historically excluded. So that should require even of the people who would be considered Black, for us to take seriously the fact that we are Black and we have been created Black by these conditions. So those of us who now navigate Stellenbosch as Black people, we need to sit with the discomfort of being in this space in order to ensure that Black people can consider this their home in a way that recognizes their dignity and does justice to the historical trauma that we have experienced. So in short, no, but we must do the work of centering Blackness.
Thank you, Ashwin. Before I go to the next question for Demaine, Professor Sarojini Nadar, would you like to come in here? We have the comment from you, privileged suicide. If you do want, we can try and unmute you. Okay, it's a no from her. Okay, to Demaine. From where does your interest in existentialist discourse come? The personal aside of the struggle with structures to be changed, and that is from Chris Lombard.
I think my interest in existentialist thinkers is, you know, their willingness to deal with the messiness of it all, not just the messiness of society and life, but also the messiness of who we are as individuals. And I don't think theologians often enough is honest enough about dealing with those kinds of realities. So like many other people, I had to go look elsewhere, you know, to in a way speak to my condition, my imperfections, and also, you know, the anomalies that I see in myself. And I think the existentialists, they grapple with that, they deal with that, and, you know, they accept that we are a mess, you know, to some extent, but, you know, we also have this capacity or potential for many things. So I think that sparked my interest in people like Camus. But of course, more than just Camus. But I think what also speaks to me is their willingness, especially Camus, his willingness to also find meaning amidst the meaninglessness. You know, find the joys of also living. You know, in the time that we are living in. Because it's not all doom and gloom, because that's often, you know, what we can also create in terms of assessing, especially critically assessing what's happening around us. You know, there's also beautiful things amidst these ugly things happening. Family, life, love, all of these things are happening, you know, in conjunction with all of these ugly things. So that's why I think existentialists are, for me, quite key in, you know, in dealing or bringing all of these things together. So yeah, in a nutshell, that is, you know, what draws me to them.
Thanks, Demaine. We have about 4 minutes left before I give a short final word to Ashwin, Ella, and Demaine. There's a question for the panel, so everyone welcome. In Namibia, Chris Lombard says there's a new interest in understanding Marx in our state of poverty. Any comments on that?
Just repeat that again, Henco.
So Christy says in Namibia there's a new interest in understanding Marx in our state of poverty. So any comment on that general comment, a new interest in Marx relating to...
I mean, as a card-carrying Marxist, you know, whatever term we're using these days to refer to those people who wear red, I think we must be very careful for us in Africa, I think we need to be very much more critical about just relying on Marx and European Marxists. I think we might really need to continue to go back to Nyerere and Nkrumah and draw on our own African sources and Sankara and our own African sources when we think and conceive of these anti-capitalist societies. That's my only comment.
Look, I'm always a bit suspicious when these names of you know, some of the classical theorists are referenced, especially in the world that we live in today. I always find it troubling. I also find it a little bit lazy in a way, that we are, you know, draw so easily on these theories, which of course has its place and value. But I think one also needs to deal with the complexity that comes with the world that we live in today. Marx would probably, you know, I think be quite, you know, taken aback by what we are confronted with today. Because I mean, after all, Marx, like all of us, we all have our limitations, and you know, to venerate these people, and of course in South Africa we know about venerating people. I always find it a little bit suspect and also a little bit lazy, because somehow we generate these artificial responses to complex, wicked problems, which I think you know, we need to do the hard labor, and we need to think through and work through some of the difficulties that we are confronted with today. And with this, I'm not saying we should throw the baby out with the bathwater, because that would be foolish. But at the same time, we also need to deal with the realities of today. I think that is, at least that's our responsibility as thinkers, as people. Yeah, that's the least we should be doing.
Demaine, thanks for that. Our time's running out, but there is an interesting question also for you from Mahokoto. Question is, what about kenotic theology as it relates to the concept of reconciliation between Bella and Stellenbosch? What kenotic movements needs to be made by both places? We can end off our conversation with that question.
Yeah, I think very, very quickly, I think, you know, in a way we've alluded to that. I think we need to be willing to let go of our privileged positions as people. And at the same time, I think, you know, as Black South Africans, we, as difficult as it is, giving more of ourselves to make sure that we create the type of society that we long for, is something that we need to think about. And with this, I'm not saying we should go soft. I mean, we should go in very hard, but at the same time, you know, you cannot speak about kenosis or the incarnation without talking about giving of yourself, even in a situation where you have been wrong. Look, if you are not willing to deal with that, then I think it's we shouldn't call ourselves Christians. And that's why I'm so careful to call myself a Christian, because I know it's so radical. It's not something to play around with, especially when thinking about self-sacrifice and giving in situations where you are perhaps the one who have been victimized. So yeah, let's think about, you know, what we are saying when we call ourselves followers of this radical religious movement, which is Christianity. So that's just my thoughts on it. But of course, again, I think, you know, if you think about white South Africans, we should be, you know, white South Africans should be open and honest about, you know, their privilege. I find it very disheartening when you speak to white compatriots that they talk about how hard they've worked. I always say my father's worked hard for 50 years of his life. He's still in Bishop Lavis, so it's got nothing to do with hard work. I mean, or it's got very little to do with hard work. So let's not use hard work as a means to justify the privilege that you enjoy as a white South African. It's as simple as that.
Thanks, Demaine. We need to wrap up. Ella, if you would shortly comment on your comment that you've posted there.
I don't think I have much to say, except that any conversation about kenosis that should include the critiques of this from feminists and womanists on the danger of this kind of language from women, for women, and for others, but especially for women.
Ashwin, any last word from you? Thanks, Ella.
No, I'm settled. Thank you.
So a question for pondering, because our time's run out. How does queer theology deal with kenotic theology? Very good question. Thanks, Ashwin. Thanks, Ella. Thanks, Demaine. Thanks for a wonderful session. We now have a 28-minute break before we return to listen to Rachel Bart, Kerry Day, and Aaron Conradi on public theology and the grammar of faith. We see all of you at 5 o'clock. Thank you so much.